Dante's Divine Comedy, the Inferno, Cantos 11, 12, 13, and 14. Dante and Virgil have emerged from the circle of the heretics, and no doubt it has been quite a grueling experience for them, not just going through the circle of the heretics, but from the time they had entered the circles of hell, first of all, the circles of the indifferent, limbo, and the circles of the lustful, the wrathful, the gluttonous, the misers, the avaricious, and having to battle with all the demons who wanted to prevent their entry. They take a moment of respite, so to speak, before they go on their journey. And it is at this stage, while they are having this moment of respite, that Virgil takes the opportunity to explain to Dante the structure of hell. And from Virgil's discourse, we know at once, and indeed the discourse of Virgil is a very clear evidence, provides us with very clear evidence that the hell described by Dante here is more a literary construct than the eschatological reality that it is supposed to be. First of all, we notice that Virgil's description of hell is taken literally from the system of virtues and vices described by Aristotle in his Nicomachean Ethics. The Nicomachean Ethics was very revolutionary from the 12th century onward in medieval Europe, because it brought about a new way of thinking about moral behavior. Until then, morality in Western Europe had consisted in a series of do's and don'ts, keeping the Ten Commandments, of course. But with Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, we see a new approach to moral behavior, morality, to a new system of ethics, to a new system of ethical thinking, which is much more in harmony with human development. With the Nicomachean Ethics, Christians in medieval Europe realized that morality was much more than just a series of do's and don'ts, which would be very superficial. But with the Nicomachean Ethics, they realized that morality also consisted in developing the virtues that form human character. And on the reverse side, so to speak, of avoiding the vices that distort and destroy human character. And this was why the Nicomachean Ethics of Aristotle was such a foundational text for medieval, and I would say even today, modern ethical theory in the West. In this work of his, Aristotle divided the vices according to a system of gradation of malice or gravity. There were some vices which were more serious than others because they were more effective in destroying character, human nature, than others. Basically, there were three categories of vices. The most serious category was that of fraud or deceit. The second category was that of violence. The third category was that of lack of restraint, or as Dorothy Lee Sayers translates it in her own translation of the Inferno, incontinence. And I believe all of us would agree with Aristotle's system of the gradation of vices. We all know from our own experience of life, those of us who have been cheated, those of us who have been deceived, those of us who have been played out, that deceit and fraud is actually the worst thing that a human being can do to another. And secondly, we all know fraud, deceit is worse than violence. Violence, of course, is just as harmful, just as hurtful, just as disastrous, destructive as deceit itself, but deceit is more subtle. Violence, at least, is something open. We are confronted by it. But deceit is something that sometimes it is very hard for us to detect. And the moment we do, one has fallen into a trap already from which it is so difficult to emerge. And thirdly, incontinence, the lack of restraint, overindulgence in one's passions, impulses, and instincts. That too is destructive, that too is harmful, but perhaps not as much as violence or fraud, because this lack of self-restraint or incontinence, as Dante calls it, is hurts or injures only oneself. It damages it only damages one's character without, or at least without any probability that it would hurt others, presumably. Perhaps the question may be asked, why does Virgil give this discourse at this stage in the trajectory of the Inferno? Why wouldn't he have given it at the very beginning, before they entered hell itself? That would have been more practical. And we all know today, before you embark on a journey, before you enter, for example, an exhibition hall, there would be guides who would explain to you what to expect, where to go, and so on before you enter. The reason why Virgil gives this discourse at this stage in the trajectory was very simply, first of all, as we recall in Canto 2 of this Canzone of the Inferno, Dante had already showed signs of great reluctance and hesitation. And if Virgil had described the structure of hell in great detail at that point, it would only have aggravated the situation for Dante, so that he would refuse absolutely to go on with the journey into hell. Secondly, I believe the reason why Virgil gives this discourse at this stage is for the sake of pedagogy. I believe today in education or in teaching someone something, it's not like before. When I was a child and when I was much younger, the way to teach and the way to learn was simply to provide a person with the principles of the subject, and that was it. And we had very little experience of what it was all about. Everything was book knowledge, so to speak. But today, one can notice that the approach is much more different. Today, before learning anything, one would just throw you into the swimming pool, as it were, and make you grapple with it for a while before explaining things to you. One begins learning something with experience rather than with a knowledge of principles. And the belief is simply because that would be a more effective way of grasping and appreciating the subject that is to be taught. To have some exposure, so to speak, to what the subject is all about, without any knowledge or understanding. But with that experience and that exposure, one adds a study of principles, a study of structures, a study of values, a study of ideals, theories, and so on. And all this is added on to this substratum of experience. And the belief is this would be a more effective way of mastering the subject. Likewise, I believe Dante had the same perspective, the same approach. For him, it would have been more effective to go through the first circles of hell, the circles of incontinence, as one would say, and to have a first-hand experience of the torments. And then after having had this experience, to be taught, to be enlightened, to be instructed as to the reasons, as to the structure of hell, and therefore to have a better understanding of how destructive, how harmful the vices can be. Thirdly, I think the reason why Dante places this discourse of Virgil at this stage is purely autobiographical. I think Dante is very subtle here. He has been through all the circles of incontinence. And now that he is about to enter into the circles of violence and fraud, here at this stage, he interrupts his whole trajectory to provide us with this discourse by Virgil on the structure of hell. And the purpose is, I believe, he wants to tell us in his own way that he would have very probably been culpable of sins of incontinence, but he would never be culpable of sins of violence and fraud. He was not perfect like all other human beings. He had his faults, he had his vices, he had his sins, but he wants to tell us these sins were just sins against continence, sins of a lack of restraint in the way he managed himself, his feelings, and his desires, and no more than that. And therefore, he has shown us that he has gone through the circles of incontinence without any instruction, without any discourse to help him to understand what those circles were, because he himself probably had experienced these sins himself. But now that he is about to enter into the circles of fraud and violence and fraud, he say, I don't know what these faults are. I don't know what these vices are. I have had no experience of violence and fraud within myself. I don't know what it is to be violent. I don't know what it is to be deceitful. So you better tell me. That in effect, that is what the whole discourse of Virgil on the structure of hell is all about. And so one comes to the circles of violence. And there are three forms of violence, Dante tells us. The first form is violence towards the other. The second is violence towards oneself. And the third is violence towards God, art, and nature. So Dante is saying violence against other is less serious than violence against oneself. And violence against oneself is less serious than violence against God, art, and nature. And of course, many of us would not agree with this gradation of the gravity of violence. But Dante, we need to understand Dante's structure in the wider perspective of the structure of the vices in Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. what Dante wants to say here, violence against the other, of course, in a certain sense, in a general sense, is much more serious and harmful than violence against oneself. But in the context of the other categories of vices, of incontinence and fraud, one could say violence against the other is less serious against violence against oneself, because the violence against the other only leads to violence against oneself in the end. And that is a perspective very few people have about violence. One thinks generally that a person is violent against the other because the person wants to defend himself, or the person wants to vindicate himself, or because the person wants to reinforce a sense of security and well-being within himself, so he is violent towards another. But at the end of it, in the final analysis, Dante is saying to us, but in the end, he who is violent against another will eventually end up being violent with himself. And that is why he categorizes these two forms of violence in this way in the Inferno. And those of us who know the Gospels know what our Lord himself said, Jesus, to Peter, when Peter had cut off the ear from the servant of the chief priest: he who lives by the sword dies by the sword. So those who are violent against the other, and we all know, sadly, unfortunately, there are too many cases of this we read of in the media. The violence that consists in physical, moral, psychological abuse of others. And Dante says here, what the violence that they inflict upon others comes back to them. In the circle of the violent, these people who are violent against the other are literally drowning in a river of blood, and that is in Canto 12. And this is a very powerful image reminding us that those who commit violence against others, the hurt, the harm, the destruction, the pain, the grief, the anguish, the despair that they have inflicted on others because of their violence will eventually come back to them. They themselves will find themselves eventually absorbed, sunk, drowning in the same pain, the same grief, the same anguish, the same despair, the same hurt, the same harm that they have inflicted on others. They will be completely overwhelmed by it. And that is the meaning of the blood in which these people are drowning here in this circle of hell, the seventh circle. Then there are those who are violent towards themselves, those who are violent towards themselves, those who are suicidal, those who believe in hurting themselves, those who have a tendency towards self-harm, as the expression goes today, those who eventually end up inflicting violence on themselves for reasons of despair. They have given up on life, they are giving up on themselves, so they take their own lives. And in the second ring of the seventh circle, those who have been violent towards themselves, especially by committing suicide, are represented as trees that are barren, that have no sap within them, that are dried, that are withered, that have no leaves or fruit or flower upon them. And this too is a very apt, very powerful symbol of those who commit violence against themselves. In the end, what do they get out of depriving themselves of life itself? There is a certain sterility, a certain barrenness. In short, one ends up with nothing. The absence of fulfillment, the absence of contentment. That was what they would be seeking in doing violence to themselves. And it's not just suicide. Today we talk about other forms of violence towards oneself, masochism, and so on. Of course, today people would say Dante is not right in condemning suicides like that. Today, one has a more compassionate and gracious perspective on those who are suicidal and those who commit suicide. The tendency to believe that these people are not to be blamed entirely. New research in psychology have revealed that sometimes they cannot be blamed if they take their own lives. The human psyche is something so complicated, so complex. The interaction between will, reason, conscience, emotion is something so unpredictable that no one knows what goes on or how one goes about this interaction within oneself of reason, conscience, will, and emotion. Some would go about it in a right way, some would go about it in not a right way. But if they do not go about it in the right way, maybe it's because they were not told, they were not advised, or maybe the strength of emotion was such, and therefore they took their own lives. Even in the Catholic Church today, the Church does not refuse burial rites to suicides anymore. In the old days, they would be refused a Catholic funeral. The best that could be done, the best and the most that could be done for them was to bring the hearse to the entrance of the church and leave it there. And the priest would come out dressed only in a black cassock without any liturgical garments, just in his ordinary work clothes, one could say. And the priest would say a silent prayer without making a sign of the cross. And then the body would be taken to the cemetery. And if it was a Catholic cemetery, it was buried at the very entrance of the cemetery in a plot that had not been blessed or consecrated. That was the attitude. But today, no. The Catholic Church gives them the same dignity, the same privileges as it would give to anyone who had died a good and holy death. But Dante is simply saying here, at the end of the day, in a final analysis, those who inflict harm on themselves violently end up with this barrenness, this sterility, this absence of fulfillment and contentment that will go on forever and ever and ever. Finally, those who are violent against God, art, and nature, those who blaspheme, those who insult, those who offend God, those who go against the normal order of things in morality, in education, in intellectual discourse, in every aspect of human existence, where we know there is a norm. There is a norm that must be adhered to if there is to be any harmony, order, well-being in society, in the community, and in the individual as well. And that norm is what is known as the natural law. It applies in every aspect of human existence. Within the human individual, there is the harmony of reason over will, will over the passions. In the community, there is the natural law which says that those who are better, those who have greater integrity, should always have superiority over the others in order to govern, in order to govern them in a sense, not to oppress them or to put a clamp on them, but to govern them in order that each and every one should contribute to the common good. And also between God and man, there's a natural law which says that we have to obey God and his law. But as it was in Dante's time, but even today, worse, these norms of behavior that the natural law dictates to us is being transgressed, is being pushed aside, is being ignored. And the norm for behavior is no longer the natural law, but pure human instinct and impulse that is more centered on the self than on others and on God. And there is this violence that manifests itself in works of sacrilege, blasphemy, a violent abuse of authority, a violence, contempt of authority at all levels, and going against one's natural instincts of altruism, of working for the common good. And this is what it is to go against God, art, and nature. That Dante is saying here. And the punishment for going against the norm that has been established by God, the punishment for rebelling and defying against the natural order of things established by God, is simply forever to be confronted, to be in the face of what one has defied, what one has rejected, what one has abused. And that is what is happening here. These people are lying on the ground and they are constantly faced with the integrity of what they have tried to destroy through their rebellion and defiance of the natural order. And this is a terrible thing, a terrible punishment, to look at that thing which one has hated, which one has despised, which one has tried to twist, distort, corrupt, disintegrate, bring to an end. And yet, in spite of all one's efforts to do that, the thing is still there in all its beauty, in all its integrity, unharmed, unimpaired, resplendent still, permanent, inviolate. And one looks at it and one feels the bitterness, the anger, the rage, the deep frustration forever that one has failed in going against the natural order. And in doing so, one will live forever with that constant frustration within oneself. And that's a terrible feeling. And so this is the lesson that Dante wants to give us in these cantos about violence. I'll try to proceed with the next canto in a short while. Thank you.